इंजीनियरिंग ग्रेजुएट्स को सोशल साइंसेज की भी अवेयरनेस होनी चाहिए, लिटरेचर की भी, फिलॉसफी की भी, so that whatever engineering they do is also done thoughtfully with respect to and taking into consideration the needs of society.
Do you think that the IITs have managed to address the knowledge asymmetry or the technology asymmetry between India and the West?
I hope you agree with me.
Yes, of course.
And that is not good for anyone, least of all for the student concerned, because इतना pressure पड़ जाता है बेचारे students पे.
Hello and welcome to Likhawat. I am Gautam Chaube, your host, and this is a show about the books of Bharat. This week on Likhawat, we'll talk about an institution that has, over the decades, inspired awe, admiration, has fueled national imagination. The institution is IIT Bombay, and the book this week is Monastery, Sanctuary, Laboratory, 50 Years of IIT Bombay, an account of IIT Bombay by Professor Rohit Manchanda. And joining us in the studio is the author himself, Professor Rohit Manchanda. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Gautam. Not just for having me here, but also for taking such an acute interest in institutional history. It's a kind of thing that somehow doesn't have so many takers very often.
Right.
And I think it's very nice of you to bring it into, at least under the spotlight for a while.
I'm so glad you think of it like that. We think of the IITs as the jewel in the national crown. And yet very little is known about their origins. शायद हम सरकार कमेटी की रिपोर्ट के बारे में जानते हैं या हमें ये पता है कि IIT खड़गपुर सभी IITों में सबसे पुराना है. But beyond that, very little is known. In your account, while you're putting this history together, you must have come across episodes, कुछ ऐसे लतीफ़े आए होंगे, कुछ ऐसे episodes आए होंगे जो आपको बहुत revelatory या surprising लगे होंगे. Take us through some of those.
काफ़ी सारे थे गौतम. There were quite a few of those sorts of things which I hadn't anticipated when I was doing my research. और होता क्या है कि there is a certain folklore that gets built up.
Yes.
Whether it's the history of the nation or whether it's the history of a microcosm like IIT Bombay or the IITs in general, a certain folklore gets built up जिस तरह से कि ये नेहरू जी का idea था. It's Pandit Nehru's brainchild, the whole idea of the IITs.
Right.
When I started doing my research, मुझे ये पता चला कि in fact the idea of such institutions being set up in India predates independence itself and any thoughts that Pandit Nehru may have had by something like a good 15 years. What I found was, interestingly, that the first seed of the idea was in fact sown in British colonial times. As far back as the early 1930s, right. Not even early 1940s, right. Early 1930s. Right. And the idea was this.
That's even before the Government of India Act.
It's even before the Government of India Act, as you say. So आप देखिए कि किस तरह से ये एक काफ़ी पुरानी सोच है, उसको शेप दिया गया बाद में 1940s में, 1950s में. लेकिन जो सोच थी वो ये थी कि the British Empire didn't see itself dwindling. In the early 30s it was at its very summit.
Right.
और उनको ये बिल्कुल ही महसूस नहीं हो रहा था कि भाई अब बिखर जाएगा.
The sun will never set.
The sun will never set. कि sun will actually start setting on the empire. So they were thinking ahead, planning ahead. And what they felt was that in the Indian subcontinent as a whole then, a lot more infrastructure was needed in order to sustain the empire. So whether it is railways, or whether it is bridges, buildings and so on and so forth, they envisaged a great explosion of infrastructure. And now for that, engineers were needed. Britain, as we all know, was too small a country to supply engineers in such numbers to a vast subcontinent.
Right.
So the idea was कि यहीं पर अब जो पाकिस्तान है, भारत है and so forth, subcontinent में, let's set up some institutes of higher technical education and let's train engineers here itself who will then serve the empire in general, but will plug into administration, plug into the services.
Also because they couldn't trust the German engineers.
Yeah, I suppose by the early 1930s that had become very evident, and it was soon to boil over into all sorts of horrendous things, of course. Yes, you're absolutely correct. And nor could they, it's also not so much a matter of trust as of capacity. So British engineering system की इतनी capacity ही नहीं थी to produce engineers in such numbers कि भी अफ्रीका में पहुंचा दें, इंडिया में पहुंचा दें, जहाँ जहाँ एम्पायर था हर जगह पहुंचा दें. So then some amount of local training was required, and that was the idea, that let's have some engineers trained right here on the spot in the subcontinent, so that they can serve the interests of empire building further. Or if we wish to put it a little more mildly, if we don't want to ascribe that sort of very instrumentalist motive, just to run the country, run the railways, run this and that and the other. इस तरह से फिर ये सोच पैदा हुई थी in the early 1930s. उसके ऊपर फिर काम काफ़ी हुआ. By around 1936 there was a document that was brought out called the McCabe Report. Very few people know about it.
Yes.
Shrouded in history. But that was where the whole thinking process began. And अगर आप इस तरह से देखिए कि 1936 में McCabe Report आई, और जो सरकार कमेटी इतनी फेमस है IITs के, वो 1945 में उनकी रिपोर्ट आई. सो 9 साल उधर भी निकल गए थे प्लानिंग वगैरह में, आस्ते 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 प्लानिंग करते करते. एंड 1945 वाज स्टिल 2 years बिफोर इंडिपेंडेंस. उस समय भी ब्रिटिश राज को ऐसा नहीं लग रहा था कि हम इंडिया ये जो या सब कॉन्टिनेंट जो है वो हमारे कब्जे से निकल जाएगा. So this was one of the very surprising findings that I made, and there are others, of course, but I think we have limited time, so we can move on to.
Your book is curiously titled Monastery, Sanctuary, Laboratory. प्रयोगशाला एक मठ और एक शरण स्थल. प्रयोगशाला नेचुरल, इट्स एन IIT. मॉनेस्ट्री भी शायद समझ में आता है, विद्यार्थी से अपेक्षित है कि वो अल्पाहार लें, गृह त्याग दें. बट व्हाई डू यू कॉल इट अ सैंक्चुरी?
Yes. Well, Gautam, it's a question that has not been put to me in exactly the way that you are putting it to me. So thank you for that, because people have said, yes, I like the sound of the title, and I love the way that you've just used these 3 words or something to that effect. But whence the word sanctuary? That is a question that I haven't been asked before. And to that, what I would say is, let's say take the first word, monastery. Now, here's an idea, it conjures up this vision of people secluding themselves, sequestering themselves in order to be able to, let's say, study. In the strict sense of the word, religious study, but it could be any study. Immerse themselves in study of some kind. Laboratory, of course, where science and engineering are concerned, आपको laboratories चाहिए ही. लेकिन मैंने ये भी सोचा कि, और उन दिनों ये ख्याल भी होता था, when I researched the book, उन दिनों ये ख्याल भी होता था कि अगर आप पढ़ाई करना चाहते हैं डीप इमर्शन के साथ, तो उसके लिए आपको sanctuary भी चाहिए. And what do we mean by sanctuary here? So if you look at other connotations of sanctuary, it also denotes refuge,
Yes.
a haven,
Yes.
where you can be cloistered, you can be cut off from the rest of the world and be able to focus on what you wish to do entirely. So without that sort of element, your studies may not be able to get anywhere. Or if you look at the history of universities in India also and across the world, even though there have been, many of them have been set up, they seem to have been set up in cities. To begin with, they were set up away from cities, and of course then the cities expanded and
Yes.
brought them into their fold. But they were set up actually sometimes quite consciously in fairly remote regions, so that this seclusion could be brought about. This feel of a sanctuary, of inviolable cloisteredness, where you could pursue your studies without distraction and without infringement of various kinds.
Right.
And when IIT Bombay was set up, it was that sort of atmosphere. Because Powai at that time, where IIT Bombay is, if you look at Powai in relation to the rest of the city of
Yes.
Bombay or Mumbai,
Yes.
पवई बिल्कुल ही फार फ्लंग था उन
हम
दिनों।
उसकी बायोडाइवर्सिटी के बारे में कुछ देर पहले बात कर रहे थे।
जी, उसकी बायोडाइवर्सिटी के बारे बात कर रहे थे, और वो इसलिए था क्योंकि वो शहर से काफ़ी दूर था पवई। अब in a way it's been swallowed up by the city, जैसा मैं कह रहा था होता है, it's been swallowed up by the city। पर उन दिनों जो फादेस्ट सबर्ब्स थे बॉम्बे के, उनमें और पवई के बीच में एक सुनसान सी सड़क होती थी जिसके ऊपर आप 7 बजे के बाद शाम को जा ही नहीं पाते थे, क्योंकि वहाँ होल्ड अप्स हो जाते थे।
राइट।
डे लाइट, ऑलमोस्ट इवनिंग लाइट रॉबरीज हो जाती थी। सो इट वॉज दैट डेसोलेट एंड दैट आइसोलेटेड, and I felt that, right, now, here is this institute that's starting out, wishes to be a center of study of a very different kind, because IITs were conceived in a very different way.
But how do you look at IIT Bombay as an engineering college or as an oasis of entrepreneurship and innovation?
I would say that it's been fluid with respect to time. So जो आप ये elements you are bringing up, to begin with, it was an engineering college. Even though it was, of course, it had the stature of an IIT, right, but shuru mein it was really just a college of instruction. और हुआ क्या था कि सरकार कमेटी के recommendations के तहत it was conceived of as being a very different kind of engineering college. Engineering colleges तो तब भी थे देश में। अन्ना यूनिवर्सिटी में बहुत स्ट्रॉन्ग थी इंजीनियरिंग, रुड़की का फेमस कॉलेज था, वर्ल्ड फेमस इवन देन, और इस तरह से BHU में थी इंजीनियरिंग काफ़ी स्ट्रॉन्ग एंड सो फोर्थ। लेकिन IISc बन चुका था, लेकिन ये सोचा गया था कि IITs में एक अलग सा करिकुलम ड्राफ्ट किया जाए, बनाया जाए, जहाँ पे फॉर एग्ज़ाम्पल 5 साल की कोर्स हो बीटेक की, और उसमें 1.5 या 2 साल एट वेरियस स्टेजेस स्टूडेंट्स आर्ट्स एंड ह्यूमैनिटीज़ वगैरह की स्टडी करें, not just engineering.
Right.
So it was meant to be a well-rounded education.
Not just a course on functional English.
Not just a no, absolutely not just a course on in fact, it was mandatory to take courses in things like philosophy, not just languages but also history, social sciences, and so forth. You could choose, of course, there were electives that you could choose, but you had to take a certain number of credits, which amounted to almost a year's worth of a program to make this well-rounded engineer as it was hoped.
It used to be a 5-year program.
It used to be a 5-year program. अब तो of course काफ़ी बरस हो गए हैं since it's been a 4-year program, but between the late 50s, mid 50s, late 50s, all the way up to the early 80s, 1981 तक, it was a 5-year BTech program. और उसके पीछे ये सोच थी कि इंजीनियरिंग ग्रेजुएट्स को सोशल साइंसेस की भी अवेयरनेस होनी चाहिए, लिटरेचर की भी, फिलॉसफी की भी, so that whatever engineering they do is also done thoughtfully with respect to and taking into consideration the needs of society, and we can of course talk about that at greater length if you want later, but this is how it evolved.
In one of the chapters you suggest that in addition to chronicling the history of IIT Bombay over the past 5-6 decades, you also attempt to capture the mood of the university, the mood of this premier institution. What do you mean by that? और अगर मैं आपसे पूछूं कि पिछले 6 दशक में जो इंस्टीट्यूशन है इसका जो मिजाज बदला है, उसको आप कैसे देखते हैं?
You're absolutely correct, Gautam. I've spoken of it. I've written in this vein कि I tried to capture the mood. तो हुआ क्या था कि when I started researching IIT's history, क्या होता है कि जब आप किसी इंस्टीट्यूशन की भी हिस्ट्री को थोड़ी नज़दीकी से देखते हैं और नज़दीकी और गहराई से देखते हैं, तो there is a certain kind of anthropomorphic transformation that comes about. You start treating the institution, you start viewing it as a person. It comes across to you as an organism, and it's as if you are dealing with the evolution of a child maturing into let's say becoming a juvenile, and then a sub-adult, and then an adult, and so forth. Or what I mean by,
you like to see it young.
Sorry?
But you like to keep it young.
You like to keep it young, of course. An educational institution, you would like to keep its temper and its spirit young at all times. But uska mood फिर भी बदल सकता है from time to time.
Right.
And what I found was that in the 60s, for the first decade of the existence of IIT Bombay, there was such an upbeat mood of optimism, but even more so of exploration. क्योंकि बिल्कुल ही नया experiment try किया जा रहा था of this very different curriculum. People were excited about it. Faculty were excited about it. Students were excited about it. They didn't, of course, have such an awareness of historical backdrop. Their parents were excited about it. कि इस तरह का एक अलग तरह का इंजीनियर यहाँ से प्रोड्यूस होगा IITs में से, जिस तरह का पहले नहीं हो रहा था यहाँ पे. तो 1960s में with great gusto, people plunged themselves into this experiment, staff, faculty, everyone. And of course, there was this this great keenness, this eagerness to see कि अब इसके results क्या निकलेंगे. 1970s में अगर आते हैं तो हम देखते हैं कि there is a certain kind of consolidation going on. So the mood was still quite upbeat, but it had shifted to seeing if things could be improved in this direction, improved in that direction, और भी strong की जा सकती है क्या, और research शुरू किया जा सकता है क्या. So I had touched upon this, you had brought this up कि शुरू में the IITs were seen as engineering educational institutions. Then in the 1970s वो research वाली बात आनी शुरू हो गई ज़हन में, and people started wondering, well, all right, how do we then get this started off? Another kind of exploration, not just curriculum but also research. And you come to the 1980s and you find that there's a completely different mood that takes over, and that is a mood of despondency. So it was rather a surprise to me, because मैंने expect नहीं किया था जब मैं IITs में, actually IIT Bombay में मैं early 90s से हूँ, लेकिन I had never really known कि 1980s में इतना एक slump आ गया था in the mood of the place.
Why was that?
The reason was कि एक तो financial difficulties बहुत ज़्यादा थी,
जो पूरे देश में थी, and of course IITs could never be completely immune to that. They were of course viewed as being somewhat pampered, somewhat spoilt, but if you looked at the for instance infrastructure in IIT Bombay as an example, it was crumbling because the financial situation was so tight. वो जो ड्रीम था 1970s का कि चलो रिसर्च में अब देखा जाए कैसे आजमाया जाए रिसर्च को, needed more investment.
That investment wasn't forthcoming. So that dream had to be forestalled, at least stalled for a while, and people felt of course a little thwarted. So other than that, funding आती भी थी तो उसको spend करना बहुत मुश्किल होता था because of all the bureaucratic red tape around the place, as we all know. 1980s और mid 90s तक ये mood of almost despondency and diffidence कि भी हम कुछ कर नहीं पा रहे हैं जो करना चाहते थे. ठीक है, academic programs ठीक ठाक चल रहे हैं, but at the same time वो academic program, मैंने कहा था ना 1960s में वो excitement थी कि देखा जाए इसका result क्या निकलता है. अब 80s और 90s में उसका almost एक adverse outcome निकल आया, and that was what was known as the brain drain.
Yes.
Pretty much all of so many of the graduates of IITs went overseas. Right? Not too many, not as much as was made out by the media, and there were statistical studies to show that. But you know how it is कि कभी-कभी क्या होता है कि एक dominant narrative बन जाता है, और वो dominant narrative बन गया था IITs के बारे में कि ये लोग तो बस packaging कर रहे हैं for export, and the countries that are gaining from the IITs being set up in India are USA and certain European countries. A U-turn, late 90s, and you can trace it to the switch in national policies, liberalization, economic liberalization, wealth generation within the country, and export and so forth. So economic liberalization की वजह से, which was set afoot in 1991, the impact was so great that by the late 90s and the early 2000s, the IITs were actually finding themselves flush with funds. That's why I say a complete about turn हो गई थी. Of course, that it takes a little bit of time for it to sink in, this kind of a thing, and for the mood to change again. But वो हुआ by around the mid 2000s, it was again very, very upbeat, very optimistic again, and almost self congratulatory क्योंकि जो हाँ sorry आप कुछ
You
कह
speak of the early enthusiasm,
Yes.
the 70s and the 60s when it was set up. Who were the first recruits at IIT Bombay? What expertise? Because हम सुनते हैं कहानियाँ कैसे महामना मदन मोहन मालवीय देश के अलग अलग हिस्सों में जाके टैलेंट को लेकर आते हैं, सर आशुतोष मुखर्जी जाते हैं और सीवी रमन को लेकर आते हैं. IIT बॉम्बे की क्या कहानी है?
IIT बॉम्बे के साथ भी इस तरह से कुछ हुआ था कि एक्टिव हेड हंटिंग जिसको कह सकते हैं वो हुई थी. Try and find the best people here, there, everywhere, bring them to IIT Bombay. And it was not just done at the institutional level. The interesting thing is कि the ministry took a great deal of interest. उन दिनों Ministry of Education होती थी जो अब फिर बन गई है, बीच में MHRD बन गई थी. उन दिनों Ministry of Education में there was a gentleman called Mr. Humayun Kabir.
Right.
He had played actually a very big part in getting the IIT Bombay project started.
Right.
Gotten the USSR, for example, to become the collaborating country for IIT Bombay and so forth. So, and he was a diplomat, a public servant, and he played an active part in spotting people, for instance, graduating from Britain, America, luring them back. And of course, from within IIT, the directors, the first directors, deputy directors, they reached out. To for example IIT Roorkee, Anna University and so forth, and try to get the best possible people in. So I can take certain names which may not mean anything to present day viewers, but because they are such towering names in IIT Bombay's history, I think they deserve a mention. Professor Kelkar the who was the first deputy director of IIT Bombay. He was a real luminary and a visionary in terms of academic curricula, strengthening the foundations of engineering education and so forth. He served for 10 years as director of IIT Kanpur also, and oversaw its growth. And then there was Professor Kane in physics, who again, very many of these people with their own bare hands, they set up the first laboratories. There was not that much technical help available then. They themselves did all of this laboratory building so that students could be trained in experiments and so on and so forth.
Now, of course, the IITs are in fact leveraging their resources and providing technological leadership to the less developed countries of the world. IIT Madras has a center in Zanzibar, Delhi has a center in Abu Dhabi.
Yes.
But during the early phases, each of the IITs was tied up with a certain European country or with the US. In the case of IIT Bombay, the tie-up was with USSR, back then a technology powerhouse of the world. How did that work for IIT Bombay?
It was, again, it came, it was one of those surprises that kind of sort of rattled me a bit when I looked into it, when I researched IIT's history. It rattled me because when you look at it on the face of it, then a link with or a collaboration with a technical superpower such as the Soviet Union was at this time would be taken to be highly beneficial, right, for the institute in question. When I started speaking to people, interviewing people about this, I found to my astonishment that most of them felt it to be a mixed blessing.
Right.
And some of them actually felt it to be a hindrance, that this link that had been established with the USSR, had it not been for that, IIT Bombay may have progressed and evolved faster. हुआ क्या था कि सोवियत यूनियन में उन दिनों आर्म्स रेस तो चली रही थी, कोल्ड वॉर चल रही थी. So there was a great emphasis on manufacturing. Of course, the Soviet education system also was very, very strong, but that also had been skewed a little towards development, not so much towards fundamental research, but development and armament development and so on and so forth, and lots and lots of factories, industrial development. The Soviet collaborators couldn't quite, I think, sense कि किस तरह का यहाँ पे curriculum बनाने की कोशिश की जा रही है. So what they sent, for example, for the laboratories of IIT Bombay, let's say mechanical engineering की laboratory बनानी है या chemical engineering की बनानी है, जिसमें students कुछ tinker around कर पाएँ, कुछ सीख पाएँ, उसके बदले वो लोग mini factories भेज देते थे पूरी की पूरी, like small scale industrial plants कि भाई इसके ऊपर सिखाओ. in the first place, for such a scale of things, there never used to be the space to set them up. And in very practical terms, उनकी power requirements इस तरह की होती थी कि आप उनको setup नहीं कर सकते थे. और फिर the kind of instruction that you would actually impart through those would be the level of instruction of a diploma.
Right.
Not of a BTech in engineering. You know, ITI जैसे होती है उस तरह की. So you had all of this.
Innovation का scope थोड़ा कम रहेगा.
Innovation का कम, and even technical education का जो scope है वो narrow down हो जाता है. तो as you can imagine हुआ क्या फिर कि on paper IIT Bombay got a lot of aid. A lot of equipment and so forth was flowing in from the USSR, and it seemed as if IIT Bombay would get off to a flying start. और हुआ क्या कि actually it impeded the curricular development at IIT, let's say for about 10 years.
Oh.
So then IIT Bombay had to make up for a lot of lost ground, because इस तरह की चीज़ IIT कानपुर या दिल्ली या IIT मद्रास के साथ नहीं हुई थी, बिकॉज उनके कोलैबोरेटिंग कंट्रीज थे जर्मनी, ब्रिटेन, फ्रांस, और उनकी आउटलुक बिल्कुल अलग थी सोवियत यूनियन से.
But in the subsequent decades, do you think that the IITs have managed to address the knowledge asymmetry or the technology asymmetry between India and the West?
I think so. I mean, not completely, of course, and that will still take a bit of time. But I suppose by knowledge asymmetry, what you mean is knowledge generated through research and the asymmetry in that.
Yes.
That used to, of course, be a very deep and wide gulf throughout the 20th century, let's say, and in the IITs particularly, because they were so new in the 1950s and the 1960s and focused on teaching rather than research.
Also to lessen our reliance on technology transfer.
That's right, that's right. So अब क्या हुआ है कि okay, let me just give you a snapshot, I think, of what I think has happened. कि over the 50s, 60s and 70s, for the reasons that I have already recounted, कि research करना बहुत मुश्किल, पहले तो mindset ही नहीं था, फिर जब mindset आया तो research हो नहीं पा रहा था. So knowledge generation was therefore suffering. Foundational research couldn't be done so effectively, and we therefore lagged behind so many other nations, European and American nations, by decades. We were lagging behind them by all those decades जहाँ हम लोग कुछ कर ही नहीं पा रहे थे. फिर 90s में वो turn around आया. Then what started to happen was that from the IITs, research of such caliber started to happen and get published, that actually people started to take notice of it. Again, in those countries that had a long tradition of this kind of research, right. Japan, Europe, America, and they could see that, everyone could see that if you were given enough resources, if you were given enough time to get things done, then you could do research as well as anywhere else in the IITs. But of course it's a slow process because you have a lot of catching up to do.
Professor Manchanda, इन दिनों एक भोजपुरी सोहर की धूम है. It goes like this: हमरा बुझाता बबुआ GM हुई हैं, ना उता DM हुई हैं. It translates roughly like this: that I have a feeling our dear boy will become a GM, better still a DM.
Yeah.
But to millions in India, हमरा बुझाता बबुआ IITian हुई हैं. That son will go and get a position in the IIT, get enrolled in an IIT.
Yes.
What accounts for the continued success of the IITs? The initial blueprint or the patronage that they have received from different governments, or the faculty and the students who work there?
Well, having grown up in Bihar, I can, this sort of echoes a great deal with me. भोजपुरी में जिस तरह से इसको couch किया जाता है. And yes, वो IIT का एक कैशे हो गया है, एक स्टैम्प हो गया है, which is so sought after, कि लोग अब इस तरह से कहना शुरू कर दिए हैं कि IITian हो गया है बबुआ, that sort of thing. Historically, it wasn't always like that. Once again, this is something that is not such a surprise to me when I researched history, but did come as a revelation. In the 1960s, apparently, amongst students, you asked about students and their parents, it was more about curiosity. This new experiment was being tried, right, with the curriculum, very different from the existing engineering colleges. And the IITs hadn't established themselves by then, they were just incipient. Then what happened was that the IITs established themselves, and also the products of IITs, the graduates, started to occupy positions of certain eminence and responsibility even within the nation. And that is a story that is not often told, but it started to happen. You know, heads of public sector companies, heads of corporations, and of course a lot went overseas as well. All in all, however, it could be seen that IIT graduates were enjoying a lot of success. Of course, the very many stories where things don't work out so well for graduates, they get shrouded, but that's another matter. In the 1970s and 80s, I would say that curiosity turned into desire. Subtle switch. So there is a desire now कि भी IIT जाए और वहाँ से पढ़े, तो there are certain prospects that the girl or the boy can enjoy, mostly the boy and the family can look forward to. Now, unfortunately, आप जैसा कह रहे थे, imply कर रहे थे, unfortunately now it has become a frenzy. पहले curiosity थी, फिर desire हुई, लेकिन अब frenzy हो गई है IIT भेजने के लिए. I hope you agree with me.
Yes, of course.
And that is not good for anyone, least of all for the student concerned. बिकॉज इतना प्रेशर पड़ जाता है बेचारे स्टूडेंट्स पे. आपको पता ही है कि अब 7वीं 8वीं कक्षा से उनकी तैयारी शुरू की जाती है कि IIT के लिए ही ट्रेन करो, IIT को ही अपने नज़र में रखो और उसके कोचिंग क्लासेस, ये वो ट्यूशन्स, ये करो वो करो. केवल एक मकसद होता है, बस IIT पहुंचना है.
प्रोफेसर मनचंदा, लिखावट पे थोड़ी लिखावट की बात हो जाए.
That's right.
I once chanced upon a 19th century syllabus of College of Engineering, which is now IIT Roorkee. It was put together for the 1871 batch. Students were required to pursue some courses in social sciences and languages. They had to choose 2 out of English, Latin, no not English, Latin, Greek, German and French. And there was a compulsory course in Hindustani which comprised translations of Tota Maina Ki Kahani, Amir Khusro's Bago Bahar, Betal Pachisi. As a university that produces students who are poised to take leadership positions in nation's socio-economic life, how important is it for the IIT graduates to cultivate an appreciation of arts and literature? You are a novelist, an accomplished novelist yourself.
Well, thank you for saying that, the accomplished part of it. Perhaps I am, but I just do it out of an instinctive liking, and I can't help it in a way. I can't help doing it. It's in me, and I have to do it. The urge is too strong. But to come to the question that you raised, first of all, let me compliment you on the extensive research that you've done, because I didn't know this, the facts that you mentioned just now about the curriculum. I didn't know this. But to answer your question at the end in one word, I would say it is imperative. I think it's imperative that engineers, while they train in or study their engineering, also have a panoramic view of what they are going to deploy their skills at, and where they fit into the world around them. How do they fit into the world around them? Why do I say that? I say that because let's take a civil engineer, and let's take some of the mountainous regions of the country where sometimes medical access is hard to come by. I'm talking about medical access because, as we know, in the mountainous regions you can have these deep river gorges, valleys which are impassable. There may be a town on one side with, let's say, medical care, other infrastructure, and the villages on the other side that have no access, even though it may be just a few hundred meters away, but there is this gorge in between. Now, civil engineers would build a bridge to span that gorge, and building that bridge will not just allow commerce to take place, it won't just allow sort of flux of people to take place, it will actually allow people on the other side to avail themselves of the medical care on this side. Right? And what that does, medical care and also other amenities, what that does is to provide a level playing field. For instance, education. You may have a concentration of educational institutions on one side, not on the other. So it provides, then it starts to provide a level playing field where children from the other side, people in general, can also have access to the same resources.
Right.
And without access, if you don't have access, that's what really squashes your desires, squashes your ambitions. And through literature, for example, I mean, this is social sciences or whatever, but through literature, you gain empathy. Right. So very many of us have found that we have started to understand the point of view of another, no matter how superficially different they may be from us. We have started to be able to comprehend and empathize with their point of view through stories, right, through literature, through fiction. And that, I believe, is something that should be left out of nobody's life.
Right.
And the way things are happening, like I just described, whether it's the school days before the IIT education or whether it's during the IIT education, these things are kind of squeezed out.
Right.
These are getting completely squeezed out. What we need to do is to bring these things back in, so that you have a wider sensibility at work, and much better tuned to, let's say, what the nation desires and how they can plug in and so forth.
थैंक यू प्रोफेसर मनचंदा, आप हमारे साथ जुड़े और IIT बॉम्बे और भारत में इंजीनियरिंग के इतिहास से जुड़े इतने जाने अनजाने पहलुओं से हमें मुखातिब करवाया. आपका बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया.
आपका भी बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया गौतम जी, क्योंकि इस तरह की जो हिस्ट्री है, इस तरह के इतिहास है, उसके ऊपर इतनी नज़र डाली ही नहीं जाती है, एज वी हैव डिस्कस्ड. एंड सो थैंक यू फॉर ब्रिंगिंग इट टू द फोर फ्रंट ऑफ दिस सॉर्ट ऑफ डिस्कशन. And a lot more needs to be done, and this is the first step, I believe.
I'm so glad.
Thank you.
Thank you, viewers. I'm sure you've loved today's episode, and the episode has inspired you to look deeper into not just the history of IITs, but of the institutions that have been a part of your life from your early days. To check out our previous episodes, do look up the Likhawat playlist on Sansad TV's YouTube channel and post your comments there in the comment section. I'm Gautam Chaube, your host. You keep watching Sansad TV. Namaste.
संसद टीवी के और भी प्रोग्राम्स देखने के लिए सब्सक्राइब करें हमारा YouTube चैनल और हाँ, इन्हें लाइक और शेयर करना ना भूलें.